grey. It's lovely. Finally.
The air quality here is terrible.
Yeah, I thought it was bad in Brussels, but where are you at the moment?
Forgive me for interrupting. Loukas, how would you like to be introduced?
Loukas.
I think we're live now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'll just give it a moment or two before we start the session to allow people to join. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our lunchtime seminar on the absolutely fascinating topic of what can we expect from Ursula von der Leyen's second term as president. As we know, the European Parliament is scrutinising the various commissioners at the moment, and there's clearly quite a lot of a political battle taking place. My name's Catherine Barnard. I'm Professor of European Union Law here at the University of Cambridge, and I'm delighted to have with me three excellent and highly knowledgeable speakers who are going to answer this question. First of all, Loukas Tsoukalis, who, as you might have just heard, just wants to be introduced as Loukas without any of the bells and whistles, but with a globally respected and fantastic CV. Sophie Pornschlegel from the Europe Project Law Institute, and Fabian Zuleeg, who is Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre. Now, for those of you who've joined us before, you know the drill. If you could put your questions on Slido, I already see some coming in, and then I will read out as many as I can get to. But just before we look at your questions, can we just start with the basic exam question, which is on the front of the tin, which is, what can we expect from von der Leyen's second term as president? And Fabian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a difficult question because we have the continuing perma-crisis, as we have called it. And in particular, we have Trump now coming in January, which I think needs to be taken very seriously. It's a major change in the global environment for the European Union. We have many unresolved issues, of course, including Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And the question of that is going to be one of the immediate questions, which is also going to be posed by the Trump presidency. So I think what we are going to see from the von der Leyen Commission is firstly that the priorities haven't really changed. The list of priorities which both the member states have put together, which the Commission President has mentioned, I think will be, broadly speaking, what will guide the Commission also in this mandate. But the big question, which was already there, but which has now been accentuated by Trump, is how do we actually deliver that? How do we implement these different priorities? And there, I have to say, I'm rather concerned that what we're going to see is what we've called the progress illusion. That yes, we are going to do some things, but what we are going to do is nowhere near the scale and the scope of the challenges which we are facing. So we have exponential challenges. We have to find a way of ensuring that Ukraine is not pushed into a ceasefire, which leads to more instability in the medium term. But we have at the moment no real idea of how we can implement that. And my final word would be, I think we should also not focus too much on the Commission. I know it's very much this moment in time in the political cycle when everyone gets very excited and we look at different names and we look at the political drama of the hearings. But the real question is not going to be who exactly is in and who's out. The real question is, what are member states going to allow the European Union to do?
Thank you. That's immensely helpful. Sophie, do you agree?
Of course, I agree with my former boss. So I work at Delors now, and we focus a lot on sustainability issues. I would agree that there's been a lot of thinking that has been done in the past year with the minister report on crisis preparedness, with the Letter report on deepening the single market, and with the Draghi report on competitiveness. And I think there is a clear line on where the priorities are, both in defense and security, of course, and also on competitiveness. The big issue I see is that I would agree that, the question is, how do we get there? And I would also say that despite now focusing on the Commission, because it will start its work, hopefully on the 1st of December, the big issue is that, there is very little leadership from the member states. The Franco-German alliance or motor or engine, or however you want to call it, is not really there. They're both lame ducks. We do have a government in France, but Macron has been weakened. With Scholz, we will have new elections coming up next year. So it's quite hard to see any kind of leadership coming from those member states. I hope that from Tusk, there is something coming, and also from Keir Starmer, potentially, especially on security. But it's quite hard to see, who can take the lead. And without any member states and political initiatives, it's going to be very hard for the institutions to do anything. So the question is, ambitious program, yes, but how to deliver it? The second point is that there will be really difficult fiscal issues to solve, because if you have those priorities, they're going to be extremely costly. Supporting Ukraine potentially without, US support is going to be costing us billions. We do have to pay back the Next Generation EU fund from 2026 onwards, which risks also crunching the EU budget, MFF, and the negotiations will start on that. We also saw that, a big part of the EU budget is agricultural subsidies. With farmers on the street who don't want to kind of have less subsidies, it will be very hard to negotiate all of that. So that's the second point where I'm a little bit concerned. The third point is that also on the clean, or would say the Green Deal, it really risks falling behind. We have a clean industrial deal that has been planned and will probably come out, which hopefully will be ambitious. But the question is also, how do we do that, knowing that we also lost the US as a partner when it comes to, global climate leadership. And maybe the last point, knowing that, we are discussing it also within the context of the relationship with the UK. I think what's important is that, from a UK perspective, there is a real interest in having European unity. I'm currently in Rome also with discussing transatlantic relations, and I think that Trump is going to try to have special deals with different member states, which risks fragmenting more the European continent, and I think it's not in our interest at all. I know it's difficult to find that European unity when you do have people like Viktor Orban, from Hungary, also in the European Council and, blocking some decisions. But I think it's something where we really need to have a stronger look at what our common interest is and make sure that we keep in mind that geopolitical context.
Thank you. Loukas, listening to all of that makes you think, why on earth does von der Leyen want a second term as president? Would you take the job?
Well, you're asking us, what do we expect in the times of the unexpected? Because unexpected is the key element in the times we live in. I remember we in Europe, including, of course, the UK, we have 2 wars on our borders. We have a revisionist Russia. We have an increasingly unpredictable protector of last resort, namely the United States, with a newly elected president who turns unpredictability as the main element of his policies. We are facing a loss of competitiveness. We are lagging behind in technology. And we are facing an existential challenge in the form of climate change. And on top of all that, we try to make policy in Europe with fragmented societies, fragmented political systems, and increasingly ungovernable countries. I mean, if that is gloomy enough, I don't know what the hell would be. I think that the new Commission will face the challenge of handling both security and economics, and in fact, the connection between the two. The arrival of Mr. Trump is going to very much change the scene, because remember that the first Ursula von der Leyen Commission had invested an enormous amount in having close relations with the White House of Mr. Biden. And now you have the return of Mr. Trump, who really not only changes things, but we don't know how things will look like in the foreseeable future. So that is a huge challenge. Would I have taken the challenge if I were Ursula von der Leyen? I don't know. There may be degrees of masochism that people have.
Thank you. That's an immensely helpful, if deeply depressing, introduction to the challenges facing President von der Leyen and her Commission. May I encourage all of those of you who are listening to put your questions on Slido and to vote for the questions that you would like to hear. Let's just start with the basics. I hear what you say, Fabian, that don't focus too much on who's up and who's down in the Commission. But what is actually happening about the appointment of the commissioners? How many, we've got an anonymous question here, how many of the candidates are still waiting Parliament approval?
I do think that it is not so important that we focus on this, because I think it is really an understanding of that this is a political game which is being played. It's very little to do with the qualifications of the commissioners. Of course, there is a focus on that, but it's really about the different groups in the parliament demonstrating their powers and giving also a signal to the commission and to the commissioners. I think it is unfortunate because we need to move on. So there is also a question here about timing. It could well be that it drags on beyond the 1st of December starting point for the commission. Which would be detrimental in terms of delivering the priorities which are there. But in the end, we are going to have a commission. We are going to have a commission which will also still contain some questionable names. We will still have the issue that von der Leyen cannot rely on a coherent set of commissioners. And we will still have, and I think that is probably the bigger change since the von der Leyen I commission, we will still have a commission which is very centralized, where everything goes through the von der Leyen portal. And that also is going to be strengthened because if anything in this new commission, we have fewer big names, fewer well-known people, fewer also internal opponents to von der Leyen. So it's going to be very much a von der Leyen commission.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Go ahead.
Sophie, you go ahead and then Loukas.
Okay, maybe just one point about this whole, I mean, yeah, I would agree with Fabian to say that, you know, it's not the most important. And I think von der Leyen tried to kind of put it together a commission that wouldn't have the same kind of opposition between, for instance, Margrethe Vestager and Thierry Breton in the last one that did not get on well together. And therefore, you know, we're making it way more difficult for her. So I think it's also in her interest to have a stronger commission that kind of can deliver the priorities. She's been criticized, of course, as well for the centralization, which I can understand. But at the same time, the positive aspect might also be that because of the new portfolio separation, or like, you know, how they built it, that you have less ability to also work in silos, which has been a huge issue within the last commission. Knowing that the kind of topics that they will have to deal with are getting increasingly complex, it might not be a bad thing to kind of have the necessity to kind of work together. The one thing I'm a little bit concerned about is also the kind of shift to the right that the EPP, so the European People's Party in particular, has been doing. Not so much von der Leyen herself, but if you look at the parliamentary decisions that have been taken, for instance, on the anti-deforestation regulation, watering it down, so EUDR, it's not a good sign, because you see EPP siding more and more with ECR, so the Conservatives and Reformists. And I think that's a development that we need to kind of continue to see, because it might also be very difficult for the Socialists and Democrats to kind of stay and, or to side with the EPP. So you might see a European Parliament that is more fragmented. And one last point on the two candidates that have been discussed, I think there will be a package deal. It's been kind of, the executive vice president Fitto from Italy against Teresa Ribera from Spain. So the one candidate from ECR, but supported by EPP, the other one for the Socialists and Democrats. I think especially at Teresa Ribera's hearing, she's been personally attacked quite a lot from EPP. That also showcases how, strongly they want to make a point. It's political games, but I think, von der Leyen has to live with the reality that we do have Brothers of Italy in Italy, that we have Orban in Hungary. So, these are people that will be nominated. And I think in terms of like how she tried to put it together, it's not too bad. So I very much hope that they will find an agreement and that it can go through.
Thank you. Loukas.
I very much agree with what has just been said. It's going to be perhaps an even more centralized commission than the one we had before, partly because there are fewer heavyweights in the commission than in the previous one. It's certainly going to be a more right-wing commission, even before the flirting with the ECR starts, because if you look at the composition of the commission, there are many more members coming from the European People's Party than you had in the previous commission. And on top of it, if there is a political decision of the EPP and von der Leyen in particular to look for alliances to the right, as opposed to sticking to the old consensus that included the socialists and the Greens and the liberals, and if you add to all that, dealing with a far-right president of the United States, you can reach certain conclusions about the direction of the Commission and direction of the world, which is not to my liking.
Thank you. There have inevitably been a number of questions about the future of UK relations with the EU. If I may, I'll just bring them together and under a broad rubric, and you can pick out the bits that you might want to answer. And I'll start with you, Loukas. But the questions include: can Keir Starmer be persuaded to drop some of his hard Brexit lines? And can he be persuaded to get much closer to the EU instead of tinkering around the edges? Do you want to, and then also for all the talk about positive relations between the EU, what's the effect of Starmer's defence deal? So do you want to start, Loukas, by talking a little bit about what you think the implications of the new Commission will be for future UK-EU relations, taking into account those questions?
I think the change in the international environment is forcing the UK Prime Minister to make clearer choices that have been made in recent years. Because if you are dealing with a more protectionist, even more protectionist US administration, the UK Prime Minister has to decide how many concessions is he prepared to make to secure access to the biggest trading bloc as far as the UK is concerned, which is the European Union. Now, we know that the factor that is likely to bring the UK and the EU closer together in the near future is security, because that is the heart, the strong negotiating power of the UK, that's where it lies. And at the same time, there is convergence, and the UK and the large majority of EU members see the world in more or less the same way, especially as regards relations with Russia and the rest of the world. And if you are dealing with a US administration that may be putting into question relations with NATO and the rest, that is bound to bring the UK and the EU closer together. But I think the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street will have to decide, for example, how much is he willing to align UK regulations to EU regulations to improve access for British products to the biggest trading partner of the UK. That may not be politically so easy at home, but it may be something he has to do for the interest of the UK.
Just before I come, thank you for that, Loukas. Just before I come to the other two, can I just draw the audience's attention to our excellent Divergence Tracker, which is, we think, unique and something that UK and Changing Europe does fantastically well. The next edition is out tomorrow. So clear your diaries so that you've got a chance to read that. Fabian, can I come to you? UK-EU relations under the new Commission, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful that we're not looking at what we want to happen, but that we are realistic about what is likely to happen. I personally don't see that there will be very much movement on the red lines. I agree with Loukas. I think there are some things which can be done. But I think when we look at the economic relationship, it will be on the basis of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Yes, we can add to it. Yes, we can improve it in some areas, but there's not going to be a fundamental reset of the economic relationship, because that would require changing the red lines, but it would also require the European Union renegotiating. And that is not going to be on the table for this moment in time. I think the reset has been positive, but the Trump election is potentially throwing a big spanner in the works. Now, it could well be, and this is the unpredictability, which we've already talked about, it could well be that Trump's actions push the EU and the UK closer together. However, it could also be that if he or his administration plays it intelligently, that it could be a divisive factor. Just to give one example, we can expect much more use of tariffs in the Trump administration, but it could be, and this has already been said in some of the circles around Trump, that the UK gets offered a special deal in return for staying close to the US rather than going with the EU. And then the question is, what would the UK government do with that kind of offer on the table? So I think it adds that uncertainty. I think, yes, clearly on defense and security, in the broad goals, we are very much aligned. We are especially aligned when it comes to support for Ukraine, at least the majority of EU member states. Of course, we also have our detractors inside. But then the question is, what does that mean in practice? How do you set that into something concrete within the EU-UK relationship? And then you're very quickly in the question around defense procurement, around what does that actually mean for the economies on both sides of the channel, where we will have winners and losers, where it will be rather difficult to make progress, not least because the US military complex is still in the background, which also wants access. So I think it is actually something where we have to be very careful and not overburden the relationship with too many expectations at this point in time. And the one area where I think there is, in the longer term, not immediately, but in the longer term, where there is actually an area where we can make significant progress, which is in the interest of both sides. And we're not focusing on this at the moment, but it's capital markets. Sophie was talking about how much money we are going to need to finance all of the priorities we have at the moment. Now that will mean we have to have access to very mature very large capital markets, and that we do not have within the European Union. So for me, in the longer term, there is a deal to be done in that area, but it will have to be on the basis of a lot of trust building, a lot of small steps. It has to be also on the basis of the UK showing that it is willing to make concessions, that it is not just driven by a very transactional, what do I get out of this logic, but that it is driven by a genuine wish of improving the relationship, of moving on from some of the acrimonious relationship we have had ever since the Brexit negotiations. And that is going to be quite difficult and has to be managed very carefully.
Thank you, Fabian. That's really very interesting. What about you, Sophie? What do you think?
Yes, fully agree with what has been said. 3 points. The first one on the divisive factor of Trump, I would only partially agree with what Fabian said, because of course we will be squeezed by Trump, potentially quite dangerous, but we also do have some agency, and I think it's up to us to have, or to make sure that we have a strategy on how to deal with that, knowing that, you know, tariffs will be coming. The question is, how do we deal with them? And also the question is, how much are we willing to pay? How much is the UK willing to pay? And then also, are we going to think more long-term or short-term? Because long-term, it's not going to help us. And I know it can be very, you know, seem beneficial to accept such deals with Trump. But I think in that case, I very much hope that decision makers will have a more long-term approach and understand that you're not changing the EU single market. We are your neighbors. You know, it's geographically, we don't have the same interest as the US. So I think that's the kind of factors that will play into it. The second question on, can Keir Starmer drop hard Brexit lines? I would also say that the red lines will probably stay on, you know, freedom of movement, customs union. We also know that, you know, it's not easy to talk about the EU in the UK. I wouldn't make it a topic because it's almost impossible to kind of win the argument, I would say. But you can make progress by showcasing that it's also in the interest of UK citizens, of their well-being, of, you know, economic growth within the UK. And I think these are very valid arguments to play out. And the third one on the relationships with the EU institutions, just as I think it's a bad idea to try to look for bilateral relations, I think it's very important for the UK government to understand how important the relationship to the EU institutions are, to take them seriously, to not do some cherry picking, and realize that it will take some time to rebuild the trust because, you know, it's been lost over the past years. Also, I would agree security and defense is important, but I wouldn't underestimate that the kind of less, I would say, hard power factors also play a role, like the youth mobility scheme that hasn't gone through. I think the EU was quite annoyed at it. I think they were saying, okay, freedom of movement, but maybe try to kind of find another way to make it work, because it's not, you know, about having massive immigration within the UK. It's about, you know, young people wanting to study. So I think on those little things, it might be good to kind of showcase that there's a willingness to move forward, and maybe not to do some cherry picking on the veterinary deal, you know, here on the musicians, but rather to kind of propose something a bit more, not vast, but have more of a deal, or kind of think about, you know, what are the aspects we want to work with the EU. Not an easy one, but I think that would be the way to go forward, and to showcase that you're willing to kind of work with the EU, knowing that they're also very busy with themselves at the moment. But I think, you know, reminding everyone of the geopolitical context we're in, of the potential Trump tariffs, of the difficulties we will have with our economy, capital markets union being a very good example. They are points where we should work together. And that means that we also both have an interest in having a better relationship.
Thank you. Next group of questions I'd like to come to is Germany and what might happen. Joel Rutter has said, how would Merz's Chancellor change the dynamic in Europe? Also, if we're thinking about Germany, if you think a bit about the UK-Germany Defence Cooperation, and what might a new government in Germany look like for its relations with the EU. Fabian, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think firstly, we have to say that at this moment in time, there's still a significant amount of uncertainty. not about the overall picture in the sense that it is virtually certain that the CDU-CSU is going to win. And that would imply that Friedrich Merz is the candidate for chancellorship. But it is the next step, which then there's a lot of uncertainty about, because it is clear that even under the best circumstances, this will have to be a coalition government. What that coalition will look like is very open at this moment in time, because when we look at the opinion polls, it doesn't look like it's going to be very clear cut. There are a number of uncertainties. One of the uncertainties is the fate of the Liberals, the FDP. They might or might not be in the parliament. In the opinion polls, they have been below the 5% threshold. A big question about how well are the Greens going to perform? Are they going to have enough to be potentially a single coalition partner with the CDU-CSU? In many ways, that's probably the most likely coalition if the votes are there. How big is the AfD going to be? Which also means how much are they going to take off some of the other parties? And then the question of how badly, and it has to be really put in those terms, how badly is the SPD going to perform? And what will that mean for the party internally? Because the big question, which is likely to be on the table again this time around, is the SPD willing to go into a grand coalition? Is it, or potentially in a grand coalition plus another party, depending on the constellation? And my personal view at this moment in time is that the SPD would not. When you're looking at the unease, which was felt the last time round, that this time they would rather go into the opposition. Now, again, this is speculation. I do not know whether that would be the case. But if that's the case, we might end up with a minority government. So a very different form of government for Germany going forward. On top of that, we have uncertainty about Merz. We actually know rather little about what kind of policies he's going to champion, what his big passions are. He does not have a background in high office, so we have not seen him perform in that kind of role. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. I would think that in many areas there's going to be continuity, but continuity can also be a bad thing. For example, when it comes to, Sophie was talking about financing at the European level, I would suspect that a conservative-led government in Germany is going to be also rather conservative about what it does at the European level in terms of financing. But the big picture for me is just simply uncertainty. We don't know many of these things at this moment in time.
Thank you, Fabian. Just before I come to the others, one of the questions that's come in, you've just talked about financing, was triggered by your earlier remarks about UKEU working on a capital markets union. Could you just say something about that and how the Germans might react to that?
Well, I think firstly, we have struggled to get the capital markets union together without the UK. So I think we have to be clear that this requires also progress within the EU before we can start talking about how we might include others into this. But I think it is very clear that a capital markets union is something which we ought to achieve in the coming years because of the financial situation we talked about. I think clearly to then include the UK would be a matter of negotiation. It would be difficult because freedom of capital, freedom of movement of capital is of course one of the freedoms of the single market. So we are talking about participation in single market type of activities. But here, I think we should also look at how the world has changed, and that we might require to do things which we thought were impossible beforehand. And I think it is, at least for me, there is a very coherent argument which says this is in the interest of both sides.
Thank you. And of course, free movement of capital is different from the other three freedoms because it does have an extraterritorial dimension. Loukas, can I come to you next? Germany, what's going to happen there? Implications for the EU?
Yeah, well, as a non-German, I can say that the obvious, first of all, that what happens in Germany is crucial for the rest of Europe. It's the biggest country, it's the biggest economy, and it is a country that suffered from a dysfunctional government for quite some time, and with an economy in real trouble. I mean, the German economy has been more directly affected from the energy crisis and Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the economic aftershocks than most of the other European economies. So having Germany in trouble, both politically and economically, and now also having a weakened president in Paris, is no good news for the European Union because, as we all know, most important initiatives in the last 30 years or so have started with Franco-German initiatives that gradually led to widening coalitions and EU agreements. So what happens in the elections in Germany is going to be crucial. But the point that Fabian made about the little we know about the most likely chancellor after the elections is serious. I mean, we don't know what Mr. Merz really thinks about the European Union. I don't know how European-minded is the most likely next chancellor in Berlin. And at least we hope there's going to be a coalition that can agree on some things, more things than the previous coalition. But still, this is another element of unpredictability. And my fear is that the weakening of President Macron in France is most unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. So I should hope as a European and an EU citizen that the German government can come up with more initiatives in the next months and years. And one of the crucial things is how the new German government is going to respond to the Draghi report, because that's going to be absolutely crucial for the whole of the EU.
Thank you, Loukas. And just before I come to Sophie, I mean, if there is this gap left by the Franco-German weakness, is it a gap that's being filled elsewhere? What's the role of Italy, Poland?
If I may just add one word, I don't think that anybody else can fill the gap.
Okay.
Neither Italy nor Poland can fill the gap.
Thank you.
I'll leave it to others.
Thank you, Loukas. Sophie, over to you.
I think that leadership gap will be a question that will continue to preoccupy us in the coming years. I think it very much depends on, like, the policy fields we're talking about. And I think that on defense and security, you could see after the European Political Community meeting in Budapest that Tusk was trying to take some more initiative, which is a good thing. But it's true that, France and Germany do remain the biggest member states, economically, demographically speaking, so it will be quite hard to do something without them. On the German elections, maybe on a more positive note, I have to say that the traffic light coalition was so incredibly dysfunctional and so inward looking that they didn't do much on EU policy making. Like, they were rather a blocking force. I mean, I could give thousands of examples, but for instance, on the supply chain legislation, CSDDD, coming in at the last minute, changing their opinions, I think it was pretty bad signaling towards also the EU institutions of the role that Germany takes in EU policymaking. So I would hope that if we have a conservative government, whether it's minority or majority one, whether it is in a grand coalition with the Social Democrats or, for instance, with the Greens, potentially with the Liberals, that at least it will be a bit more coherent. And I also would be I mean, we know that the Conservatives, they will, they are fiscally conservative and are likely to remain so. But I would say that it depends on whether the Liberals will be in the next government or not, because they have a very hard line when it comes to the debt brake in the Constitution. And I think there might be a little bit of wiggle room for Merz, or well, I hope so at least, to kind of change that if he realizes that it's also in his interest. So I would kind of it's very volatile, uncertain. We'll see what happens, but I wouldn't kind of write it off completely, knowing that we are coming from a situation where it was so fundamentally dysfunctional that not much happened. Even though, for instance, the Greens and the economics ministry tried quite hard, but they were so busy with themselves that they just didn't have the kind of leverage or interest either. And from the Chancellery, you had, I would say, a European and a foreign policy that was, I think I would say, a little bit hazardous, to put it, nicely. So we'll see what happens, but I hope that by June we'll hopefully have a new government and that will be a bit better. I'm much more worried, I have to say, about the French presidential elections coming up in 2027, which leaves us very little time. And there, despite having Marine Le Pen, who is now in a trial, so she might do some prison time for fraud she basically paid some parliamentarians and then used the money in France. But we still have Jordan Bardella, who's quite a strong candidate. And it's there again, it's also a very volatile situation within the party landscape. You're not quite sure what kind of candidates will come up. And we know that in France, people are extremely frustrated. So it might be a very, hard time. And I think that's going to be the breaking point if we have in France a far-right president who has a lot of powers. It's not the same as in Germany, where you do have more of a separation of powers and more checks and balances, I would say. That will have a huge effect on EU policy making, and that's what I'm really scared about. The question is that if we have a German government, we will have 1.5 years to 2 years to kind of do something. And I very much hope that the decision makers, Macron on the one side, hopefully Merz or someone else on the other side, will be able to kind of realize that it's a very important window of opportunity. I hope it's not going to be the same like Merkel, who lost this kind of window of opportunity after the Sorbonne speech and didn't do anything, even though we had this kind of space to do something. So yeah, let's hope that they will know.
Sophie,
maybe one last.
Sorry, you go ahead. I just was going to say, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to hear your thoughts, albeit depressing ones, on the state of the German government. I mean, is there an argument then that, in fact, that gives the Commission greater room for manoeuvre because you've got a week in France or Germany, or the opposite? And I'll come to you, Fabian, in a moment. I see you've got your hand up. That's
a very good question. I think it's quite good that we have a von der Leyen too, simply for the sake of consolidation, or at least a little bit, of stability when we are in a very volatile environment with a very challenging geopolitical context between being squeezed also between China and the US pretty much, with a weakening economy. So I think that's kind of a positive, I would say, in the current context. The question is how much power she will be able to take. And, it's always down to what member states are also giving you in terms of room of maneuver. And I work at a think tank called after Jacques Delors, who was a very strong Commission president that always didn't go down the good way. So I would very much hope that we will have a von der Leyen that is strong enough to propose stuff and is not just waiting for member states to come back, but is trying to find that kind of compromise, which is, of course, a situation that is incredibly difficult. But now that she has, I would say, quite a bit of experience, and I think she is a smart political strategist, we might see it coming. I hope so. What do you think, Fabian?
Yeah, I wanted to make a point also on this question of politicians in courts. I think we have to be very careful because this is one of the issues which has backfired badly in the US. It is not necessarily the case, but this would reduce the ability to win an election or to take power. And I think this also needs to be considered in countries like Germany, where there's now talk about potentially forbidding the AfD. It is a very dangerous tool. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think we have to look at that very carefully. And I also wanted to just follow up on the question of how strong is the Commission going to be given the member states are weak. In the past, we always said weak member states means weak Commission. What we've seen in the last years is that weak member states have often led to a situation where the Commission has stepped in and has done things where the member states didn't. However, that is a dangerous game, because what that then lacks is legitimacy. It lacks the support from the member states, which also means that what can very easily happen is that these steps forward are rather hollow, that they are not going to address what is really needed. And I think at this moment in time, we really do need the member states working together with the Commission. And I think one of the interesting things we haven't talked about here is it's not only a new Commission president. We also have a new Council president. And that is significant, because if we have a good Council president, he or she can really bring the member states together, as we have seen in previous crises. And certainly what we have now is better than what we've had up to now, because Michel certainly wasn't able to work with the Commission. So there is also some hope there that we will see an improvement in that interaction.
Can I just make one point about the courts being independent? It's just an important point, I think, because I don't want us to assume that the courts are geared against the far right or are partisan. And I think that was, that's the big narrative of the far right, that they want us to make us believe that the judiciary isn't independent. I know, of course, politics plays into it, but I would say that if you do have far right politicians that are not respecting the constitution or the law, that is down to the courts to decide, and it's not a political decision. I think that's just an important, redefinition to make of the judiciary that is independent. Maybe not in Hungary, it wasn't in Poland, but it definitely is still in France, I would say. Of course, it plays into, politics, that people might use it or instrumentalize it in a certain way, and that we need to be aware of. But if you do something that is criminal, then you should be convicted. Full stop.
Thank you. I realise that we're running slightly towards the end. There are two areas that we haven't touched on. If we could start briefly on Ukraine, and particularly what the new Commission President might do in respect of having war on the eastern border, bearing in mind the limits of the competence of the EU more generally. Loukas, I don't know if you want to start with that.
Well, I'm afraid, as far as Ukraine is concerned, the most decisive factor is and remains the US and not Europe. So if Mr. Trump comes to power and decides he wants to cut a deal on Ukraine and stop the war with some kind of ceasefire a la Korea or Germany, sort of respecting the lines that are separating the two sides, and without anybody agreeing officially on this as being the new border, it will not be easy for anybody else to disagree. So if Mr. Trump is determined to put an end to the war, more or less on the lines that we have heard about for quite some time, I think Europe will then have to decide how much of a role it wants to play in supporting Ukraine and avoiding a new invasion in the future. And the two go together. Second point, perhaps linking with the previous discussion, is I fully agree with Fabian that there is a limit to how much the Commission can do without the support of member states. And that applies to everything, including even more so to Ukraine. So, and my guess, if you want my guess, and this is not an informed guess, is that we are likely to have negotiations on Ukraine pretty soon after the arrival of the new Trump administration. And I think most of us know more or less what the terms of the negotiation will look like. And it will not be easy for Mr. Zelensky, and this is to put it mildly.
Thank you. Sophie, do you want to say anything about Ukraine? And one of the other questions that's come in is, of course, that there are hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Ukrainian nationals in the EU under the temporary protection directive, which has been, the temporary protection has been extended. What's going to happen to them?
I'll start with that one. Well, I think they're going to stay as long as there is war in their country. I think that's been one of the good responses that we had in the EU at the beginning of the war in February 2022, to not only have a sanctions policy that was, coordinated, but also to say we're going to accept Ukrainian refugees. They are war refugees, and I think to integrate them also into our labor markets, knowing that in some countries we really need that kind of skills, especially in Germany. So I think that whole debate on immigration policy also is very butchered, in the sense that it doesn't take into account the fact that we do have a demographic problem, and that does play into our economy as well. Maybe one more point on, defense security and our strategy towards Ukraine. I fully agree with Loukas that it depends on the US security umbrella, it depends on Trump's strategy towards Ukraine. I also believe that we will have negotiations pretty soon. I think it's, for the Europeans, it's down to the question of, do we have a strategy towards Russia, and one that is coordinated? What is, our position? Also knowing that there might be a fragmentation between Western and Central and Eastern European countries. And I'm very afraid of that, because Baltics and Poland have a completely different threat perception than, for instance, Spain or France, which also means that they're much more willing to invest in their defense and security than countries where the public opinions don't really care that much about the war. It seems very far away. And I would say that even in Berlin, there's not the same threat perception than, in Warsaw. So it might change, of course, with a new German government, but I think that difference in threat perception might be a dangerous thing for us, because it might keep us from having a coordinated position. And I would say that Western European countries should learn from the mistakes that they did in underestimating Russia, also knowing that Trump, likes Putin. He seems to kind of get on well with him, and that it's not their main focus on foreign policy. I think the shift to the Indo-Pacific has been happening for quite a while now. China, really, they are China hawks, so it's really their focus, and it's not so much Europe. That's my last point, maybe, that it's really important for Europeans to also understand that the EU is not, they are seen as, or they were seen as, allies by any administrations in the US, but we are increasingly relevant to them from a foreign policy perspective. And I think that's something that we need to kind of understand, that we're very much left with ourselves, and are better off being united, trying to, find the money as well to support Ukraine.
Thank you. Fabian.
So I'll try to keep it brief. Firstly, I think any cost which is associated not only with Ukraine, but any cost the Trump administration will expect Europe to cover. So we can expect that there's going to be intense pressure, including also increasing defense spending, which I think is necessary in any case, but all of those pressures will come together. On Ukraine, I agree with both Loukas and Sophie, but I would be even more bleak. If we end up in this situation of some kind of enforced peace ceasefire deal, where Ukraine loses a lot of its territory effectively, I mean, even if it's not said, then what we are facing in Europe is that we have to prepare for war with Russia, because Russia will be emboldened by this. It will not stop with Ukraine. So what this means is, yes, in the short term, we might have a cessation of hostilities, but in the medium term, we will have a bigger conflict, a bigger problem. And we will have to prepare for it, but Sophie is right. The threat perception is very different in different countries. I know the East is going to prepare for it, the North is going to prepare for it. Is the rest of Europe also going to prepare for it? We shall see, but there will be a lot of pressures not to.
Thank you. Loukas.
one quick point and slightly provocative. When you prepare for a war, you also increase the possibilities of having a war. And I personally do not think that is a very serious, real Russian threat for the rest of Europe. But this does not stop me from wanting to have good defense for Europe as a whole. But the other point I wanted to make, and that's why I raised my hand, is we have rightly spent considerable time talking about Ukraine. It's fully justifiable. But Europe has another war near its border, and this is the war in the Middle East. And I think one should be reminded of the fact that as far as Ukraine is concerned, we have more or less preserved our fragile unity, and we've done quite a bit to try to help Ukraine. As far as Gaza, Lebanon, and the Middle East is concerned, Europe is totally absent because the European Union is completely divided. And we are also accused by the rest of the world of applying double standards to Russia and Israel. And if I may continue with my slight provocation, justifiably criticized for applying double standards. And that's a serious issue, especially when we talk about the relations of Europe and the West with the global South.
Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left, and there's one last question I do want to turn to, which is the question of tariffs. We know that incoming President Trump wants to impose 60% tariffs on China and 20% on goods coming from the rest of the world. How quickly will that be done, Fabian? And do you think he will actually go ahead with it?
The easy part is to say yes, because ultimately people like Trump, and that is something we should have learned from the first administration, they do what they say, because that is his big selling point. That is what he believes in. Trump has a very simplistic view of economics, of trade. He believes that if America has a trade deficit, it shows it's being treated unfairly by its trading partners, and the way to correct that is to slap tariffs on it. Now, he's also a deal maker, so he will be looking at negotiating with countries, negotiating with all the countries. And one of the really interesting questions is going to be what he's going to do with China, whether he's going to go more with the hawks in the administration, which essentially want to freeze China out of global economic flows, or whether he will go with the more pragmatic side, or possibly the Elon Musks of this world, who actually look at more of control, but still continuing to have that economic relationship. But for Europe, it is very, very clear. He believes there is an unfair situation, and he will react with tariffs. And then the big question is, how unified are we going to be in our response? But it also has to be said, we should also not hide the fact that actually what we've seen in the last years from the Biden administration has not been significantly better in economic terms. We did not have a particularly happy relationship on many of these issues. So in some ways, this is continuity of misery.
Thank you. I realise we've very short of time. But the other question related to that, of course, the Commission has exclusive competence in respect of trading goods and other aspects. And of course, there's a small matter of the WTO rules which require equal treatment. Are all of these old norms now disappearing, Sophie?
Yes, I think Trump has no respect for the WTO, but you know the Inflation Reduction Act was not WTO compatible either. So I think in that sense we do have a certain, I would say, coherence. Maybe one point just to kind of look more domestically, the Treasury has not yet been appointed by Trump, and I think that showcases a slight tension there is, because Trump might love protectionism, he might love tariffs, and I'm sure he will do them. At the same time, he loves the stock market, and they don't like tariffs that much. And I think that's like an internal divergence that he's grappling with. where, you know, we'll see who he will appoint, and I think it will be an interesting policy area to watch to see how he's going to reconcile these things.
Thank you. Last word to you, Loukas.
Yeah, the United States has been more protectionist and more unilateral over quite a few years. So remember that much of the protectionism introduced by Trump was never reversed by the Biden administration. So the second Trump administration is likely to be even more protectionist and more unilateral. And this is, of course, a very serious problem for Europeans, not only unilateralism, but the fact that we have open economies. We are much more dependent on global economic interdependence from the United States. So a more protectionist world is a pretty ugly world for the whole of Europe.
On that cheerful note, I am going to draw this session to a close. I'm hugely grateful to all of the speakers for their time, for their insights. It must be said it's not a very cheerful picture, but I think it's a deeply realistic one. And I think it really very clearly sets the groundwork for some of the challenges facing the European Commission. So a huge thanks to the speakers, to you, the audience, for your excellent questions, and to UK and a Changing Europe for organising this.